Thank you very much, Kevin. And thank you, IDEA, for inviting me here today. And thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity today to talk to you about some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues around the world, including colleagues here at IDEA, on natural hazards and democracy. I need some... Oh, there it goes. So I'm going to be talking to you about the ways in which natural hazards can affect elections specifically, and some of the things that can be done to address those challenges that elections face when they're struck by a natural hazard. Now, you might think, oh, well, of course, they just cancel elections if there's a flood or an earthquake or a hurricane or something like that. And they usually don't. And they usually don't need to cancel elections because there are a lot of things that can be done to protect elections from natural hazards. So I'm going to be structuring my remark in terms of three categories of topic that I'll be addressing. Firstly, the challenges, specifying the challenges to elections that natural hazards pose. Secondly, the solutions. And I'm always amazed when I engage in topics to do with elections, which I've been working on for a long time now, at how the practitioners, electoral management bodies, EMBs, and people who are actually engaged in elections in some ways, candidates, voters, observers, always seem to be way ahead of academics like me in conceptualizing the problems and actually coming up with practical solutions to address those problems. And so I'm going to be reviewing some of those solutions, some of the things that electoral management bodies around the world have done to protect elections from natural hazards. And finally, you may think the last category here is a bit weird. You may say, well, how could it be that a tragic natural hazard is an opportunity? And this is true. This in some senses is true that it's a bit strange. But if you think about back to COVID or another emergency situation that you may have been familiar with in your own country, that very often after a disaster is over, people talk about, well, how can we build back better? And so what I'm going to be talking about when I talk about the opportunities represented by natural hazards and an electoral context is what build back better means for elections and how elections can actually be made more resilient, more robust, more democratic in the wake of natural hazards. So firstly, I'd like to just say a few more words about something that Kevin mentioned when he introduced this talk, and that is the project that I've been working on with Eric Asplund and other colleagues, actually colleagues around the world, on the impact of natural hazards on elections. This was something that got going in 2022. And what I've got here is just a screenshot of the database of elections around the world that have been affected in recent years by natural hazards. And in addition to this database that Eric and his colleagues have put together that includes a wealth of information about individual disasters that have affected elections, there are also about a dozen case studies we've got up there now. And I'm going to be drawing quite liberally on these case studies in my remarks. And there are a number of podcasts and other analyses, a whole wide range of resources up there, which I invite you to peruse. And in doing this work, I found it fascinating, a lot of the things that are doing that I definitely would not have known about if I'd just been sitting at home reading journal articles and books. There's a lot going on. And so what I'm going to be doing is partly summarizing some of the highlights of this project and also reflecting on the implications of the work that we've been doing for protecting elections. Okay, so starting with the challenges. The people who study disasters, there's actually a field of study called disaster studies or disaster research. They would argue that no disaster is natural because a disaster is the combination of some physical process, such as a meteorological event, a geological event, an earthquake, a flood, a wildfire, and human vulnerabilities. And so human beings being in the wrong place in the wrong time make a physical event a disaster because they are affected. And so there has been a notable increase in events that have been described as disasters. Munich Re, the insurance company, reckons that in the 1980s, there were approximately 300 disasters per year around the world that had a natural origin in some kind of physical event, such as a hurricane or a flood. And this decade, there are about 800 per year. So there's a huge increase in the number of disasters. And you might say, well, that's just climate change, isn't it? Well, it is partly climate change. We are changing the climate, and so the climate is affecting us and giving us more events that are disasters. But it's not just climate change, it's also the fact that there are more people on the planet, and so it's more likely that people are going to be in places that are going to be affected by disasters, and more of them are going to be affected. And so population growth is a factor, that people are living in a wider range of communities and a larger number of places. Also migration. So, for example, if climate change has made a farming community a place where it's no longer possible to farm because it's afflicted by drought, then the members of that community may well move into the city, and they may well end up finding themselves living in a very vulnerable community in a shanty town that has poorly constructed houses that aren't resilient to, for example, an earthquake, or it's on a vulnerable hillside that is vulnerable to erosion and flooding. If there is a flood, it might simply the houses might wash down the hillside, or in some other way it's vulnerable, it doesn't have proper drainage. And so if some event strikes that community, they are more likely to be affected. However, it's also affluent people in affluent countries moving to places that make them more vulnerable and make those places more vulnerable. So when a coastline gets redeveloped and a mangrove gets destroyed, or natural flood defenses get destroyed, and huge mansions get built there for rich people, those people move there. Not only building their mansion do they make that coastline more vulnerable to the disaster and make it more likely that there will be something that gets named a disaster, but in being there and relocating themselves there, they themselves become more likely to be victims of that disaster. And this also occurs when people move, as is increasingly the case, to areas that are in forests or on the edges of forests. They also become more likely to cause a forest fire, which becomes a major wildfire, but they're also going to be affected by that if it happens. And so people are moving to places where they are more vulnerable to being affected by a natural hazard that happens. And this is not just poor people in poor countries, it's also rich people in rich countries. Finally, development. I just mentioned the example of the coastline being built up and the natural flood defenses being destroyed. Well, that's the type of development that makes that coastline more vulnerable. And as we pave over more of the Earth's surface and we have more roads and more physical structures, then there are more opportunities for those things to be damaged when there is a natural hazard. So for all those reasons, there has been a significant increase in natural hazards. And a graph here that shows from an academic scholar chart the increase in disasters that has happened over the recent decades. So there are a lot more disasters. So election authorities are having to think about this a lot more these days. Last year, as we all know, was an election supercycle year, and Eric and some of his colleagues have worked out that there are actually 20 elections in 15 countries in that 1 year alone that were affected by natural hazards. It was an El Nino year, which means they're more likely to be natural hazards. Lots of elections, they're more likely to be hazards when there's a meteorological event such as El Nino. Nevertheless, that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of countries around the world that are having to think about natural hazards when they conduct their elections, and that's in just 1 year alone. So what do natural hazards mean for elections? Well, they create problems, they create challenges, and they create challenges for everyone who is involved in the electoral process. Election management bodies, also voters, candidates, election observers, people who go out to campaign for their favourite party and candidate. And they create challenges of a variety of different types. And the challenges vary quite a bit depending on the disaster. If there is, for example, a flood, a wildfire, an earthquake, people are likely to be displaced. There's forced mobility, right? And in being displaced, they very often move, or they are moved by the state emergency agency to an area where they are then not where the election management body expects to find them when they register people to vote or when they set up polling places for people to vote. So this creates a challenge. What do you do when the people who you want to get to the polling station aren't anywhere near the polling station? There are also often problems associated with people losing their documents. If they have to flee their house very fast because there's some major event taking place, or they simply forget their documents, or their documents get destroyed in some kind of fire, an event like that, an earthquake or a flood. And of course, most obviously, there's damage to registration facilities, polling facilities. Sometimes the ballots themselves might be affected. So there are damage to a lot of physical structures, and the roads. So to get to a polling place that's in a remote location, you have to go along a road. If that road has been washed out, then you can't go. And the power supply may well be affected in many places. And so there are damage to facilities, loss of documents, displacement, and then those are the tangible damages, and there's also the psychological impact. When a disaster has just occurred that's had a major impact on your life, you're not necessarily going to have the headspace to think about all those candidates and all those policies that they're putting forward. And so there are major events associated with a type of disaster that causes people to have to move somewhere else and damages objects, physical objects such as roads and houses and buildings. Now, other types of events bring very different challenges. For example, a heat wave, as global warming is obviously going to bring more heat waves and more context, as indeed it has. Kevin mentioned the Indian elections last year, which I'll be talking about, that were conducted in very intense heat. And the types of challenges that are brought by heat waves are more similar to the types of challenges that were brought by the COVID pandemic, because you tend to get medical concerns in the context of a heat wave. People who are more vulnerable to heat, such as elderly people, pregnant people, people who, for whatever reason, have a medical condition that makes them more vulnerable, are going to be less likely to be willing to come out to the polling station. They're going to perhaps need someone to bring polling to them, to bring a ballot to them, or they may simply decide not to vote at all. The people who are in the polling station, this includes the voters, but also the poll workers, who are going to be there all day, need to be protected from the heat. They may need a wide range of different types of protection. So there are comfort issues, safety issues, and the issue of, how do you convince people that it is okay to go out and vote, that it is safe for them to do that. So different types of disasters bring different challenges. The challenges are quite significant in many cases. And so solutions then. And as I said, I've been amazed in this research that we've done at how many ingenious solutions election management bodies have come up with across the world to help protect elections from natural hazards. And I have borrowed international ideas on diagram, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with, of the election cycle. So starting with the legal framework through to the planning phase of the election, the registration phase and election campaign, election day itself, and then the post-election phase. And solutions to the protecting elections from natural hazards can be introduced at each of these phases of the election cycle. In the pre-election phase, one of the most important things that can be done to protect an election from a natural hazard is to try to think about the risks that are involved and to try to find a way of organizing an election in such a way as those risks do not affect the election. And this involves putting together a robust risk management framework. And this can include, for example, deciding to hold elections at a time of year when the hazard that your country is most likely to be exposed to doesn't occur so frequently. It can potentially involve rethinking where you put your polling stations so that you're not putting them in places that are likely to be flooded or to suffer the type of disaster that is most likely to occur. And it can also involve putting in place means to give you early warning of disasters that take place. If there are early warning systems, if the election managers are regularly consulting meteorological reports, meteorological reports that project into the future, then they can say, well, yeah, this is going to be really bad hurricane season. We need to watch the weather reports very closely because our election could potentially be affected. So risk management frameworks are a way of trying to prevent an election from actually suffering if there is some type of event. But in addition to risk management frameworks, it's also necessary to put in place a plan B. So if you are unlucky and your election does get struck by a natural hazard, what do? You need to have a course of action that you can put in place in advance that you can invoke when a natural hazard does strike. So there have to be arrangements in place, the things that you do, and I'll talk about some of those more detail in a few minutes, but there need to be a number of contingency plans that can be put in place to protect an election if there is a natural hazard. And then, of course, staff have to be trained in those contingency plans. And ideally, training would extend to other people who are involved in the electoral process, to candidates, to election observers if they're available to receive some kind of training, and possibly even to voters for certain types of contingency plans that are put in place. They may need to know about them in advance if natural hazards are very common in the country. And finally, interagency cooperation. Now, when we come to interagency cooperation, we come up against an aspect of modern electoral systems that most electoral management bodies are very proud of: their independence. Now, for the last 40 years, election management bodies that are most independent should be the ones that have been often most proud of the way they hold elections. And so it's sort of, we tend to think that, of course, yes, election management bodies work on their own. They don't engage, they're not under political influence, they're an independent, separate agency. However, when it comes to natural hazards, it's very, very useful for election management bodies to coordinate with other agencies: health agencies, emergency relief agencies, often meteorological agencies. And it's useful to put together these structures of coordination in advance, to have standing relations with other agencies that can be brought into play if there is some kind of disaster. And usually it's those other agencies that are better at doing the horizon scanning to see if there's likely to be a disaster coming up, to do the early warning. The election management body often doesn't have the expertise to do that, as well as, for example, the meteorological agency. And so the risk of natural hazards requires a slightly different way of working for electoral management bodies. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples. These are both from the United States. One example of a system that was put in place that worked quite well was California, and I did some research on this with a colleague, Jeff Fisher. And the counties in California are the ones who run the elections, and they have all, since about the last 10 years or so, put in place contingency plans to what happens when there is some kind of disaster. In most cases, it's a wildfire that's the main concern in that context, given that the major elections tend to be held in November, which is wildfire season, at the tail end of wildfire season. So they all have these plans that are suited to the circumstances of their particular county. And in the research that we did, we found that those contingency plans worked quite well, actually. They were quite effective in many cases in protecting elections. There's another case study that's part of our series of case studies that Asplund did with colleagues that looked at the impact of Hurricane Sandy on New York in 2012, and found that they hadn't put in place sufficient contingency planning. And so when they were struck by a hurricane, the governor had to issue ad hoc regulations that changed the way elections were normally run. But the training on these ad hoc regulations did not get through to all polling staff, and so that there were different practices in different places. The polling staff were confused, the voters were confused, and things did not go well. And if you have polling staff who are acting in ways that confuses voters, your voters are confused, the polling staff aren't quite sure what to do, this is a situation in which the election management body is going to lose the trust of other stakeholders, and particularly voters. So this is definitely something that you don't want to happen if you're an election management body. So being prepared, having a plan B, putting in place contingency measures in advance is very useful. During the election period, there are a number of things that can be done that differ from what's normally done to run elections, and other things that can be done that can be integrated into the normal running of elections. So relocating polling places is an obvious one. If certain parts of your area are flooded and you put polling places somewhere else, and having polling places that can be easily moved, or having identifying in advance in your management of the election, identifying in advance alternative polling places can make that relatively straightforward. Also, alternative voting arrangements. And these include the greater flexibility for voters in when they vote, where they vote, and how they vote. So allowing people, for example, in Peru, they have a system, choose your polling station. You can look up, go on their app and decide where you're going to vote. You're not just allocated a particular polling station. So if there is a disaster, your polling station that you normally vote at somehow gets affected by a flood or a wildfire or something, you go to a different one. So that type of flexibility makes it less likely that any individual is going to be negatively affected and prevented from voting. Also, having voting over several days, early voting, or simply holding an election over a number of days, makes it less likely that a disaster is going to cripple an election, because if it's impossible to get to the polling station on one day, well, a few days later it might be possible. And there are also some countries that are able to put in postal voting systems, voting by mail. Not all countries have postal systems that are really strong enough to do this, but in some cases that is also a possibility. In addition to these types of arrangements, which are very commonly integrated into electoral systems around the world and have other benefits for democracy, there are also sometimes some special measures that are put in place if there is a very serious emergency that wouldn't normally be considered robust enough to use on a regular basis, such as, for example, internet voting or telephone voting, or in some contexts, mobile ballot boxes are used when there is emergency, but they might be considered somewhat problematic in other contexts because of the risk of vote farming in some institutional contexts. And so alternative voting arrangements, having flexibility for voters into when to vote, where to vote, and how to vote will make your election much more resilient to any type of natural hazards. Alternative forms of voter identification, which might mean neighbours vouching for other neighbours as to who they are. And then also, if there is, for example, a heat wave, protecting people in polling places, putting medical facilities in polling places, cooling facilities, water, shade, all those things that can make it the polling places safer for both the staff and for the voters. And so I'll give you some examples. One example is India, which has a very impressive electoral management body and has put in place a wide range of measures to protect Indian voters from the heat. As one of our case studies goes into great detail as to all the huge number of arrangements that have been put in place, including cooling, including mobile ballot boxes for vulnerable people, medical facilities at polling stations. And as I'm sure, as Kevin mentioned in his opening remarks, I'm sure you all read about the newspapers that elections in India were affected by the horrific heat of over 50 degrees Celsius, which I can't even imagine how it might feel to be voting or even to be doing anything when it was that hot. They held elections, and tragically, the measures they put in place were not successful in protecting everyone. But nevertheless, if they hadn't had those measures in place, I expect the situation would have been much, much worse. So those measures that were very detailed and very well planned in advance went a long way towards protecting Indian voters in a very, very difficult context. And then you have the situation of Mexico, which also voted last year. Mexico also has an excellent electoral administration, one of the most impressive electoral administration bodies in the world. And they also have very detailed lists of all the different natural hazards that might affect elections in Mexico, but heat's not one of them. And they had heat that wasn't at the same level as India's. It was about 40 degrees in some places. And a lot of the people weren't that prepared, and there weren't facilities put in place to enable people to have shade when they were waiting to vote. And so a lot of people had heard that there were long, long queues for voting, and the turnout ended up being quite a bit lower than it probably would have been otherwise. And perhaps if they had some preparations in place and had made arrangements to prevent there being such long queues at polling stations, then they would have managed to convince more people that it was safe to go out and vote. Finally, solutions in the post-election period, and this is when it comes to looking to see what happened and try to make improvements, assessing interagency coordination mechanisms. Did they work? Could they be improved? Do we need to change the way we do it? Looking at contingency plans, how could these be tweaked to possibly make them a bit more robust? Updating staff training needs, and possibly working with legislators to bring in some legal reforms to make the entire electoral system more robust to natural hazards. And I'll give you two examples. These are both sort of successful examples. From the Caribbean island of Montserrat was affected by a volcanic eruption in 1995 that made large parts of the island uninhabitable because of lava flows. And at that time, Montserrat had a single-member constituency electoral system, and a large number of the constituencies were simply destroyed. They no longer existed. And this obviously created problems for representation, but it also created problems for, how do you elect someone from that constituency if it doesn't exist anymore? And so in 2001, they moved to an island-wide proportional representation electoral system. So it didn't matter where people were physically. They could still vote and be represented on the same basis as everyone else. So they changed their electoral system to accommodate the changed circumstances of the island, but also to make the system more robust in the face of possible future volcanic eruptions or other disasters. Another example is from a case study study we have of two Canadian provinces, one of them being Alberta. So in 2023, Alberta had some very widespread forest fires that affected a lot of the province. As we read about the forest fires in the news recently, and there were terrible forest fires 2 years ago also. And so following those fires, they decided that they had been holding elections in May, which is forest fire season. And so they decided to move their elections into the end of October, which is sort of just at the tail end of the forest fire season, so that the elections wouldn't be in future so vulnerable. The election cycle meant that they haven't had an election under the new timing yet, but they worked with legislators to say, listen, it just doesn't really make sense to hold elections in May because they're likely to be disrupted by forest fires again. Now, of course, not all countries can do that, because in some countries there are constitutional provisions that require an election to be held at a particular time or set the term of a particular office, such as the presidency or the parliamentary term, to a specific length, a specific period of time, which means that elections need to be held in March or November, whenever they are. So it's not always possible to change the date of the election. And sometimes, the electoral system itself can be written into the constitution. And of course, constitutions can be changed, but it's often more difficult to change constitutions. So this changing the law is not always an option for everyone if there's certain aspects of it that are written into the constitution, but very often there are changes that can be made that make elections more resilient in the face of natural disasters. Okay, so I've given you a number of examples. But in general, what have election management bodies been doing? So the Electoral Integrity Project, which is an academic research project, regularly does a survey of EMBs. And last year, that survey included a question on different measures that EMBs have taken to protect their elections from natural hazards. And this survey included 50 EMBs, and the results here are a little graph of the different measures that EMBs have taken to protect their elections. And contingency plans are the most common, as you can see. Over half of all EMBs around the world have put in place contingency plans to protect their elections from natural hazards. Also interagency cooperation, which is good. I mean, they're developing new ways of working, cooperating with other agencies to try to make sure that everybody knows what's happening and how that might affect elections. So the meteorological agency doesn't just think of people being flooded out of their homes, it also thinks about the polling stations being flooded. And then other strategies that I mentioned, such as putting in place comprehensive risk management frameworks and special voting arrangements to protect elections from natural hazards, are a bit less widely practiced, but there are still quite a number of EMBs who are doing that. So election and management bodies around the world are taking initiatives to protect their elections from natural hazards, which is actually quite a good thing. So then moving on to opportunities. How can we build back better in the election sphere in the wake of a natural hazard or an election that's been affected by a natural hazard? And I would argue that build back better can be understood in three ways in the election context. Firstly, the modernization of electoral processes. Second, resilience building. And thirdly, the enhancement of the profile of the EMB and creating trust in the EMB in general. And these all have knock-on effects for EMBs in other spheres of activity as well. And so in this sense, a natural hazard can be seen as a stress test for elections. I told you before, there was a field of academic research called disaster studies. And that field of academic research, one of the findings is that there's often a phoenix effect in the wake of a disaster. Communities rebuild and they redesign. They design their institutions, their structures, their communities, the ways of living in a different way. And often this involves modernization. And so disasters can often trigger moves to update election practices. As I mentioned, there's certain aspects of electoral law are written into the constitutions in many countries, but many, of course, are not. And so the Bahamas, for example, in the wake of a Hurricane Dorian in 2019, they decided that it would make sense for their country to modernize their election registration system and move from a system of periodic registration, which is a bit rigid and fixed and doesn't necessarily accommodate election management staff needs when there has been a disaster that has displaced a large number of people. They decided to move to a continuous election registration system, which is much more flexible. And this is, many countries around the world now have continuous registration systems. It is a more modern system, and it is better suited to a context when there is population displacement. And so it was the natural disaster triggered a process that improved the institution overall and had other positive knock-on effects for other aspects of the electoral process. And then there's resilience building. Now, natural hazards are not the only type of event that can prompt a shock that affects an election. So we can think of toxic spills, man-made disasters of various types, or terrorist attacks, or civil unrest, pandemics. There are lots and lots of different shocks, lots of emergency situations that can affect an election. And we want elections that are going to be resilient to all of those things. And when there isn't some kind of natural hazard that looks like it may well be repeating natural hazard because there's climate change, so a country might say, well, actually, we're going to have more of this type of thing, then this may prompt the state to release the funding that would enable the EMB to adopt measures that make the system more resilient, not just in the face of natural hazards, but in the face of all different types of shocks that might affect an election. And so the types of resilience building measures that I mentioned before, such as putting in place alternative voting arrangements, having elections over more than one day, having postal voting, those are all expensive. Someone has to pay for all those things. Well, if elections seem to be going okay and there doesn't seem to be any problems, the government might say, well, you don't really need this. We're trying to cut money or whatever. However, if it is obvious that elections have been affected and will be affected in future by recurring natural hazards, then the government might say, actually, we're going to cough up, we're going to pay for this. And this will have positive effects because it will make elections more resilient to all manner of shocks. And it will actually mean that people are more likely to go out and vote. Because if you can vote where you want, when you want, how you want, if there's a variety of different ways of voting, then more people are going to go to the polling station. So it will enhance democracy as well as making elections more resilient to any kind of shock. And Australia, which is another one of the countries that is notorious for having very challenging meteorological and wildfire conditions, but also famous for having an excellent electoral management commission. In 2022, one of our case studies looks at the floods that affected Victoria, and they had floods of 14 meters, which is quite extraordinary. But because elections, and this was during the election period, but because elections were held over a number of days, there was early voting arrangements, not everyone was as badly affected as they otherwise would have been, because if the floodwaters were high on one day when they might have voted, then the floodwaters would have receded on another day. So it's possible for more people to go out and vote than would have been the case if everyone had been called to vote on a single day. So greater flexibility is better for democracy, it's better for protecting elections against all kinds of other risks, and it's better for protecting elections against natural hazards. And so the shock of a hazard can prompt election management bodies and legislators to really invest in protecting elections in that way. And finally, EMB profile enhancement. Election management bodies vary the extent to which they have a really well-known profile among the population. But in quite a number of countries, they operate kind of below the radar a lot of the time. People know, oh, yes, there's an election, there's a polling station, I went to vote, but they don't necessarily think about the people who are running that polling station, or they think very much about the election management body itself. And so the election management body may not necessarily have a particularly high profile among the population. And because election management bodies have been autonomous and have been really proud of their autonomy for quite a number of years in many contexts, they may have a relatively high degree of autonomy from other agencies and may not have very long-standing working relations with other agencies. A natural disaster that means that election management bodies are communicating with the public a lot more about alternative voting arrangements, working together with other stakeholders in the system, other agencies in the state to manage the situation, will build the profile of the EMB, build confidence and trust in the EMB on the part of the other stakeholders and the voters. And if the EMB can manage the election well, can say, yes, we can hold an election even during a disaster, this means, well, that's pretty impressive. And people will come to trust the EMB, as indeed, actually, during a disaster, very often people will turn to state agencies of all kinds. This is what's known in political science as the rally round the leader effect. People are more likely to trust state agencies at times of disaster, and the EMB can benefit from that. And this will build people's confidence in election processes. And voter confidence in election processes is incredibly important. And having good links with other agencies is incredibly important for the EMB. So, of course, the downside is if the EMB manages to bungle an election held in the time of a disaster, then this can reduce confidence. But nevertheless, with sufficient planning, with management of risks and contingency planning, it is possible for election to be run in the wake of a natural disaster or a disaster that's been prompted by some kind of natural event. So there are a lot of things that can be done to ensure that elections are protected from natural hazards, and EMBs around the world have been doing a lot of things, and I found this work absolutely fascinating. And one of the conclusions we've come to in this work that we're doing is that elections are critical infrastructure that need to be protected in the same way as you protect other critical infrastructures in a state. They need to be protected from natural hazards and other shocks. And elections need to be in there, considered together with all of the other aspects of infrastructure, such as the power system, the communication system, the road system, and so forth. They are crucial to the functioning of modern states. It's also necessary for EMBs often to rethink the way they work, to work with other agencies, to communicate with voters in slightly different ways, to have a wider variety of different ways in which voters are enabled to vote. But we have found that many of the brilliant innovations the EMBs have invented to cope with natural hazards have made elections more resilient and more democratic and better overall. So EMBs are already building back better. Thank you very much.